There's a moment in Paul Gascoigne's life when the laughter stopped, the charm faded, and the world finally saw the heartbreak behind England's most gifted entertainer. It happened not on the pitch, but in a quiet hotel hallway, when a trembling, exhausted Gascoigne, once the nation's golden boy, was escorted into rehab as cameras flashed and fans watched in disbelief. This was the same man who made the world fall in love with his genius at Italia 90, now struggling to hold himself together. In that moment, the myth shattered. What remained was a fragile soul fighting demons far darker than any defender he ever faced. This isn't the story of a football clown. It's the story of a tortured genius the world couldn't save. Paul John Gascoigne was born in Gateshead, a working-class town in the northeast of England, a place where life was hard, money was scarce, and dreams often died young. His father, John, worked long hours as a laborer, tough as steel but carrying the frustrations of a man beaten down by circumstance. His mother, Carol, tried to hold the family together with warmth and quiet resilience, but the Gascoigne household was far from peaceful. Turmoil hung in the air. Arguments, stress, instability. Paul grew up surrounded by love, yes, but also fear. From an early age, he carried an anxiety he didn't know how to explain, and that anxiety would shape everything he became. On the streets of Dunstan, football became his escape. With a ball at his feet, the noise faded, the tension disappeared, and the world finally made sense. He played from morning until dusk, kicking against walls, weaving between lampposts, dribbling past imaginary defenders. The neighborhood kids quickly realized he wasn't just good, he was different. Football wasn't a game to him, it was sanctuary. Yet while his talent bloomed, life around him grew darker. When Paul was still young, he witnessed one of the most traumatic events of his life, the death of a close friend, hit by a car while they were playing together. The guilt haunted him for years. He blamed himself. He replayed the moment endlessly. Something broke inside him, a wound that would follow him forever, fueling both his brilliance and his self-destruction. As he grew older, Gascoigne learned to hide his pain behind humor and energy. He made people laugh because he couldn't bear to let them see the sadness he carried. Teachers called him restless, neighbors called him wild, but no one understood the storm inside the boy who couldn't sit still unless he had a football in front of him. His family's financial struggles only added pressure. Paul wanted to help. He wanted to be the one who finally lifted them out of hardship. So he clung to football like a lifeline. Every training session, every tryout, every moment on the pitch felt like a step towards saving himself and the people he loved. By the time he was a teenager, one thing was clear. Paul Gascoigne wasn't meant for an ordinary life. He was destined for something extraordinary, whether the world was ready for him or not. Paul Gascoigne's talent didn't grow quietly. It erupted. Even as a child, he played football with a kind of unfiltered joy that made adults stop and stare. His dribbling was instinctive, unpredictable, almost musical. He could glide past bigger boys with a wiggle of the hips, a faint shift of balance, or a burst of acceleration that seemed to come out of nowhere. Football wasn't something he learned. It was something that lived inside him. By the time he joined the local boys' club, it was obvious. Paul wasn't just gifted. He was a phenomenon waiting to be discovered. Coaches saw a rare blend of natural flair and raw intelligence. He understood space as if the pitch were a map only he could read. He saw passes a second before anyone else realized they were possible. And he played with a fearlessness that bordered on reckless brilliance. The turning point came during a regional youth tournament. Scouts from Newcastle United watched him dismantle teams single-handedly, gliding past defenders, scoring goals with either foot, creating chances out of thin air. He didn't look like a young prospect. He looked like a star in the making. Newcastle signed him shortly afterward, and Gascoigne entered an environment that would shape him into one of England's greatest talents. At Newcastle's academy, he continued to rise. Coaches were astonished by how quickly he adapted, how he could dribble through three players and then laugh as if it were nothing, how he turned mistakes into moments of creativity, how the ball almost seemed drawn to him. But they also saw something else, the emotional volatility bubbling beneath the surface. The same intensity that made him brilliant made him fragile. Still, no amount of unpredictability could overshadow his gifts. By his late teens, Newcastle knew they weren't just developing a promising midfielder. They were witnessing the emergence of a generational genius. Paul Gascoigne had been found, but the world had no idea what it was in for. Despite the brilliance flooding out of him, Paul Gascoigne's rise was shadowed by emotional wounds that never fully healed. At Newcastle, he was the academy's brightest star, but privately, he battled anxiety that tightened around him like a vice. The nightmares from childhood trauma still haunted him, and the pressure to lift his family out of poverty began devouring him from within. His first real heartbreak came during one of the most vulnerable chapters of his life. While he was still a teenager, another tragedy struck. His best friend, killed in an accident Gascoigne witnessed. The guilt consumed him. He convinced himself he could have stopped it, could have prevented it, could have done something. The trauma carved itself deeply into his identity, and instead of receiving emotional support, Paul learned to hide the pain behind jokes, pranks, and the loud personality that would later become Gazza. It was a mask. A brilliant, hilarious, dazzling mask. But a mask nonetheless. At Newcastle, he also faced criticism for his fluctuating weight. Coaches told him he lacked discipline. Critics said he didn't take football seriously. Gascoigne heard every word, internalizing them, while pretending nothing bothered him. The boy who felt too deeply was trapped in a world that demanded emotional armor. His family situation added another layer of pressure. He felt responsible for everyone, financially, emotionally, spiritually. He bought gifts for relatives, paid bills, and carried burdens no teenager should ever shoulder. Football wasn't just a dream anymore, it was survival. And that responsibility, while motivating, became suffocating. Yet through all the turmoil, Paul kept rising. Every setback only fueled his determination. Every heartbreak deepened the artistry in his game, but the emotional cracks, the unresolved grief, the desperate need for acceptance, they followed him. And as he stepped closer to stardom, those cracks would eventually split open under the weight of fame the world wasn't prepared to give, and he wasn't prepared to handle. Paul Gascoigne's breakthrough wasn't a quiet introduction to the football world, it was an explosion. By the time he reached his early 20s, Gascoigne had become the brightest rising star in English football, a player whose creativity, unpredictability, and charisma made him impossible to ignore. Newcastle fans had seen him grow from a wiry academy kid into a mesmerizing midfielder who could change a match with a single touch. But the real turning point came when Tottenham Hotspur signed him in 1988. From the moment he put on the Spurs shirt, it was clear. English football had never seen anything like him. Gazza combined raw street flair with astonishing vision. He dribbled like a Brazilian, passed like a maestro, and celebrated like a rock star. And more importantly, he played with joy, real joy, the kind that made fans feel like kids again. At Tottenham, he blossomed. He delivered stunning goals. He took over matches. He became the player English fans pinned their hopes on. But the moment that elevated him from star to national sensation came during the 1990 World Cup in Italy. England hadn't touched a semifinal in decades. Expectations were modest, but Gascoigne turned the tournament into his personal stage, dazzling the world with fearless runs, audacious flicks, and the kind of improvisational genius that can't be taught, only lived. Then came that moment, the semifinal against West Germany, the yellow card that meant he would miss the final if England advanced. When Gascoigne realized the consequences, the emotion overwhelmed him. Tears streamed down his face, not out of weakness, but out of pure love for the game. In that raw, vulnerable moment, all of England saw the truth. Gazza wasn't a showman. He wasn't a clown. He was a man who felt everything deeply, perhaps too deeply. That single moment turned him into a national treasure. England didn't reach the final, but the tournament made him immortal. His performances were electric. His personality radiated off the pitch. His tears became a symbol of passion the country had long forgotten. When he returned to Tottenham, he was not the same player. He was a cultural icon. TV shows wanted him, brands chased him, stadiums worshipped him. The kid from Gateshead, who once hid behind jokes to mask his pain, was now the most beloved player in England. But behind the fame, the pressure began to mount. Expectations became heavier, the spotlight became hotter, and the emotional wounds he carried from childhood, the ones he never learned to heal, were now colliding with fame at a scale he could barely comprehend. Paul Gascoigne had entered superstardom, but the climb to the top was only half his story. The fall would be far more heartbreaking. Paul Gascoigne's prime years were a whirlwind of brilliance, chaos, and unmatched charisma, an era when he wasn't just the best English midfielder of his generation, but a global sensation whose personality radiated far beyond the pitch. The world fell in love with Gazza not because he was flawless, but because he played the game with the emotional intensity of someone who lived every second as if it might be his last. After the 1990 World Cup, Gascoigne returned to Tottenham as a national hero, and he played like one. He dominated matches with a rare blend of creativity and ferocity. His dribbling could dismantle entire defenses. His passing carved open teams with surgical precision. And when he scored, he did it with flair. Volleys, long-range strikes, curling shots that brought crowds to their feet. But it was the 1991 FA Cup semi-final against Arsenal that defined his brilliance. A free kick from nearly 35 yards out, a strike that rocketed into the top corner, a moment that electrified Wembley and burned itself into English football folklore. Gazza wasn't just playing football, he was performing art. Yet hidden beneath the magic, pressure began pooling in dangerous ways. He felt responsible for entertaining fans. He felt he needed to carry Tottenham, and he pushed himself harder than his fragile emotional state could handle. Then came the fateful moment that changed everything. During the 1991 FA Cup final, Gascoigne, fueled by adrenaline and reckless intensity, launched into two dangerous tackles. The second challenge, wild and uncontrolled, tore his cruciate ligament and left him screaming in agony. The injury was devastating. The surgery complications that followed nearly cost him his career. And the long recovery fed into the emotional chaos he struggled to contain. But Gascoigne's story was never one of surrender. It was one of resilience. In 1992, he signed for Lazio, bringing his talent to Italy's Serie A, then the toughest league in the world. At Lazio, he became a cult hero. His humor won over fans. His unpredictable genius made him unforgettable. He scored iconic goals, including a late equalizer against Roma, that instantly turned him into a legend among the Lazio faithful. Still, the emotional turmoil persisted. Injuries, weight fluctuations, and the pressure of being a superstar in a foreign country created a storm inside him. But when he was fit, the brilliance remained undeniable. Coaches feared his unpredictability, but they trusted his magic. Gascoigne's next rebirth came at Rangers in Scotland, and there he delivered one of the greatest seasons of his career. In 1995-96, he became the heart of a dominant Rangers side, scoring, creating, dazzling in a league that had no idea how to contain him. His hat tricks, solo runs, and iconic celebrations made him a hero in Glasgow, adored by fans and respected by rivals. He won multiple league titles, inspired crowds with his talent, and created memories that Scottish football still cherishes today. At his peak, Paul Gascoigne was unstoppable, not because he was the most disciplined, not because he was the fittest, but because when he stepped onto a pitch, he played with a vulnerability and authenticity that made every touch feel like a window into his soul. But the same intensity that fueled his rise would soon consume him. The emotional wounds from childhood, the pressure from fame, the physical toll of injuries, all of it was building toward a breaking point. Paul Gascoigne had reached greatness, but the darkest chapter of his life was waiting just ahead. Paul Gascoigne's downfall didn't erupt overnight. It unfolded slowly, painfully, in small emotional fractures that deepened into chasms the world would eventually see, but never truly understand. Behind every brilliant performance, behind every joke, behind every chaotic outburst, there was a man battling demons he never learned to control. The early warning signs appeared at Lazio and Rangers. Episodes of binge drinking, unpredictable behavior, unexplained disappearances. But back then, the world brushed them aside. Fans laughed, teammates shrugged, coaches rolled their eyes. No one asked why. No one looked beneath the personality. And Gazza, terrified of being vulnerable, hid his pain with humor, defiance, and alcohol. But alcohol wasn't a habit, it was a shield, a way to silence the trauma that followed him since childhood, a way to quiet the anxiety that consumed him, a way to soften the pressure of being a national icon. And the more the world demanded from him, the more he needed that shield. When he joined Middlesbrough and later Everton, the cracks became impossible to ignore. His drinking escalated. Training became inconsistent. Incidents piled up. Bar fights, arrests, fines. But these weren't the actions of a reckless superstar. They were the cries of a man drowning in addiction and mental illness. The tabloids didn't care. They pounced. Gazza became a punchline. Years before mental health conversations became part of sport, Gascoigne was living inside a storm of depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and addiction, unmedicated, untreated, and publicly ridiculed. His personal life spiraled even faster. His relationship with Cheryl, once loving, became turbulent and violent, fueled by alcohol and emotional instability, police interventions, court cases, public humiliation. Each incident further shattered the fragile pieces of a man who had never learned how to process pain in healthy ways. Then came the harrowing episodes that pushed Gascoigne into the darkest corners of his life. Stints in rehab that never lasted, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, dangerous weight loss, public meltdowns captured by paparazzi, hospitalizations that left fans fearing the worst. The world watched his unraveling with a mixture of fascination and pity, but few offered compassion. Football moved on without him. The media devoured him, and Gascoigne, stripped of the game that once anchored him, drifted from crisis to crisis. The saddest truth was this: Gascoigne wasn't fighting football anymore. He was fighting himself. His tears at Italia 90, once a symbol of passion, were now seen as weakness. His jokes, once charming, became erratic. His vulnerability, once celebrated, became weaponized against him. He was no longer Gazza the genius. He was Gazza the broken man, a man the world adored when he danced, and abandoned when he fell. But even as he spiraled, there remained flickers of hope, moments when his humor resurfaced, when old teammates reached out, when strangers reminded him he was loved. These small glimmers set the stage for the next chapter, one defined not by brilliance or scandal, but by an exhausting, fragile battle for survival. The rise of Paul Gascoigne was spectacular, but his fall was one of the most heartbreaking in modern football. For Paul Gascoigne, the idea of a comeback was never about returning to the Premier League, lifting trophies, or reclaiming the spotlight. His comeback was something far more personal and far more difficult: staying alive. After years of spiraling through addiction, arrests, and public breakdowns, Gascoigne reached a point where his life became a series of interventions. Friends stepped in, former teammates stepped in, even strangers stepped in, desperate to save the man whose smile had once lifted a nation. Paul entered treatment facilities across England, the United States, and Europe, fighting a cycle that kept pulling him back into the darkness he'd spent his entire adulthood trying to escape. Recovery wasn't linear. It came in waves, small victories followed by devastating setbacks. There were months when Paul looked strong, clear-eyed, hopeful, focused. Then came relapses, sudden, overwhelming crashes that reminded everyone, including himself, that addiction is a battle fought one day at a time. The world judged him for those slips, but anyone who understood trauma knew they were not signs of failure. They were signs of a man who had never stopped trying. His greatest source of strength came from unexpected places: the fans who sent letters saying he saved their childhoods, the young players who thanked him for inspiring them, and the countless people who reminded him that brilliant, complicated, flawed human beings deserve love too. In his final chapter, Gascoigne began doing something he had never truly done before: speaking openly about his struggles. Not as excuses, not as headlines, but as a man who wanted others to know they weren't alone. His vulnerability, once ridiculed, became his greatest act of courage. Slowly, Gascoigne found peace in quieter environments. He appeared at charity events. He mentored young athletes battling mental health challenges. He told stories from his playing days that reminded everyone why England had fallen in love with him in the first place. He no longer chased the spotlight. He no longer tried to be the Gazza of the past. Instead, he tried to be Paul, a man flawed beyond measure, but fighting with everything he had to stay standing. His comeback wasn't a triumphant return to glory. It was a refusal to surrender to the darkness, a small, fragile, yet powerful victory. And in that fragile victory, Paul Gascoigne found something he had chased his entire life, a sense of self that didn't depend on applause. Today, Paul Gascoigne lives a quieter life, far removed from stadium lights, far from the hysteria of tabloids, far from the impossible expectations that once crushed him. He still battles his demons, but he battles them with honesty, support, and a wisdom carved from decades of pain and survival. His days are slower now, filled with charity appearances, public talks, and reflective moments in which he openly discusses the struggles that nearly consumed him. And in those moments, something remarkable happens. People don't see the headlines. They see the human being they forgot to protect. Gascoigne's legacy is complex, but also beautiful in its fragility. To some, he is the greatest natural talent England has ever produced. To others, he is a symbol of what happens when genius meets emotional vulnerability. But to millions, especially those who grew up watching him, Paul Gascoigne remains a reminder of football's greatest truth, that the sport isn't just built on discipline and strategy, but on emotion, imagination, and soul. His moments of brilliance still live in the collective memory of a nation. The tears of Italia '90, the free kick at Wembley, the audacious skill, the charisma no one could replicate. He made football feel alive, unpredictable, magical. Gascoigne didn't leave behind a perfect legacy, he left behind a human one. And maybe that's why he endures. Because Paul Gascoigne showed the world that greatness doesn't always look polished. Sometimes greatness looks like a man who fell, broke, got back up, and kept fighting. In the end, Gazza's legacy isn't the brilliance he gave the game. It's the reminder that even tortured souls can touch the world with extraordinary light.